Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern scandal, a marriage that was supposed to heal old wounds is about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. What happens when the most powerful man in Britain discovers that the woman he loves has been hiding secrets that could destroy everything he's worked to protect? In the shadows of the throne room, where whispered conversations can topple governments and family loyalty means everything, Queen Camilla is about to learn that even royal love has its limits. The guards who once bowed to her are now witnesses to her greatest humiliation, and the man who promised to stand by her side is about to make a choice that will echo through the halls of history. This is not just a story about a king and queen. This is about power, betrayal, and the moment when even the most carefully constructed lives come crashing down. When the crown weighs heavier than love, and when family honor becomes more important than personal happiness, what price are you willing to pay to keep your throne? The doors are about to close on a chapter of royal history that no one saw coming, and what happens next will change the British monarchy forever. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla Parker Bowles walked down the marble corridor toward the king's private study. Her heels clicked against the polished floor with each measured step, creating an echo that seemed to announce her presence to every corner of the ancient building. She had received an urgent message from her husband's private secretary just an hour earlier, requesting her immediate presence in his office. The tone of the message had been formal, almost cold, which was unusual for the normally warm communications between the royal couple. Camilla adjusted the pearl necklace at her throat, a gift from Charles on their 10th wedding anniversary. The weight of it felt heavier today somehow, like everything else in her life had become more burdensome in recent weeks. She had been queen consort for nearly 2 years now, and while the role came with its challenges, she had grown comfortable with the responsibilities and the public scrutiny that accompanied her position. But something had changed in the past month, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The castle staff she passed in the hallway gave her their usual respectful nods and curtsies, but there was something different in their eyes. Where once there had been warmth and genuine respect, now there seemed to be a carefully maintained politeness that felt almost rehearsed. It was as if they knew something she didn't, as if they were all part of some secret that had been deliberately kept from her. As she approached the heavy oak door of the king's study, Camilla paused to collect herself. She had been married to Charles for nearly 2 decades, and she knew him better than anyone. She could read his moods from across a room, could tell when something was troubling him just by the way he held his shoulders. Lately, he had been distant, spending long hours in meetings with his private secretary and senior advisors. When she asked about these meetings, he would give her vague answers about state business and constitutional matters. The brass nameplate on the door gleamed in the morning light, reading His Majesty King Charles III in elegant script. Camilla raised her hand to knock, but before she could make contact with the wood, the door opened from the inside. Charles's private secretary, Sir Michael Davidson, stood in the doorway with an expression that immediately put her on alert. "Your Majesty," he said with a formal bow that seemed more pronounced than usual. "His Majesty is waiting for you." Camilla stepped into the study, a room she had visited countless times over the years. The familiar scent of leather-bound books and Charles's favorite cologne should have been comforting, but today it felt almost suffocating. The room was exactly as she remembered it, with its mahogany desk positioned near the window, walls lined with centuries-old books, and the portrait of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, hanging above the fireplace. But something felt fundamentally different about the space, as if the very air had been charged with an energy she couldn't identify. Charles stood behind his desk with his back to her, looking out the window at the castle gardens where they had walked together so many mornings. He was dressed in a navy blue suit, his silver hair perfectly groomed as always, but his posture was rigid in a way that made Camilla's stomach tighten with apprehension. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was unlike anything she had ever seen before. His usually warm blue eyes were cold and distant, and his mouth was set in a hard line that spoke of a decision already made. "Charles," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that she hoped he wouldn't notice. "Michael said you wanted to see me urgently. Is everything all right?" The king walked around his desk slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He gestured to one of the leather chairs positioned in front of his desk, the same chairs where they had sat together many times to discuss family matters, state business, and their shared concerns about the future of the monarchy. But today, the gesture felt formal, almost ceremonial, as if she were being invited to attend her own trial. "Please sit down, Camilla," he said, and even the way he spoke her name sounded different. There was no warmth in it, no hint of the affection that had characterized their relationship for so many years. "We need to discuss something of great importance." As she settled into the chair, Camilla noticed that Charles remained standing behind his desk, creating a physical barrier between them that felt symbolic of something much larger. She folded her hands in her lap, trying to project the calm dignity that had served her so well in public appearances. But, inside, her heart was beginning to race with a growing sense of dread. "I've been having extensive consultations with my advisors over the past several weeks," Charles began, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for official pronouncements. "Matters have come to my attention that require immediate and decisive action." Camilla felt the blood drain from her face, though she wasn't sure why. Something in his tone, in the carefully chosen words, suggested that whatever was coming would change everything between them. She had heard him speak in this voice before, but never to her, never in the privacy of his study where they had shared so many intimate conversations about their hopes and fears for the future. "What matters?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "Charles, you're frightening me. What's this about?" The king moved to the window again, his hands clasped behind his back in the pose he adopted when he was preparing to deliver difficult news. The morning light illuminated his profile, showing the lines that had deepened around his eyes in recent years, the weight of the crown evident in every feature of his face. "It's about your family, Camilla," he said finally, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "More specifically, it's about their conduct and the impact it's having on the reputation and stability of the crown." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had always known that marrying into the royal family would bring scrutiny to her relatives, that their every action would be examined and judged by both the media and the public. But Charles had assured her years ago that he understood the challenges this presented, that he was prepared to weather whatever storms might come from that direction. "I don't understand," she said, though a part of her was beginning to fear that she understood all too well. "What has happened? What have they done?" Charles turned back to face her, and, in his eyes, she saw something that made her heart stop. It was the look of a man who had made a decision that went against his personal feelings, the look of a king who had chosen duty over love. She had seen this expression once before, years ago, when he had spoken about his first marriage and the impossible choices he had been forced to make between his heart and his obligations to the crown. "Your son Tom has been involved in a financial scandal that threatens to embarrass the monarchy," Charles said, his words measured and precise. "Your daughter Laura has been photographed at parties with individuals of questionable character. Your brother Mark has been making public statements about royal family business that violate every protocol of discretion we hold sacred." Each accusation fell like a stone into the quiet of the study. Camilla felt herself gripping the arms of her chair, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining her composure. She wanted to defend her family, to explain that they were good people who had been thrust into an impossible situation by her marriage to the king. But she could see in his face that explanations would not be welcome, that his mind had already been made up. "These are isolated incidents," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "They can be managed, addressed. My family has always tried to be respectful of their position, Charles. You know that." The king shook his head slowly, and, in that gesture, Camilla saw the end of something precious. "This isn't about isolated incidents, my dear. This is about a pattern of behavior that undermines the very foundations of what we're trying to achieve. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years because we understand that personal desires must sometimes be sacrificed for the greater good." The formal language, the distance in his voice, the way he remained standing while she sat before him like a supplicant, everything about the moment felt choreographed, as if it had been planned and rehearsed. Camilla realized with a growing sense of horror that this wasn't a conversation between husband and wife. This was an official pronouncement from a king to his subject. "What are you saying, Charles?" she asked, though she was beginning to understand exactly what he was saying. "What does this mean for us?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Outside the window, she could hear the distant sound of the castle staff going about their daily routines, the ordinary sounds of a world that was about to become completely foreign to her. When Charles finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something precious. "It means, Camilla, that I can no longer allow your family to be associated with the crown. Their presence at royal events, their access to royal residences, their use of royal connections for personal gain. All of it must end, effective immediately. The room seemed to tilt around her as the full meaning of his words sank in. He wasn't just cutting off her family from royal privileges. He was drawing a line between them and her, forcing her to choose between the people she loved and the man she had married. But even as she grasped the magnitude of what he was saying, she realized that the choice had already been made for her. "And me?" she whispered, the words barely audible even to herself. "What about me?" Charles closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, she saw a flash of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced by the mask of royal duty that had become his permanent expression. "You remain my wife and my queen," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction that should have accompanied such a declaration. "But your family, they can no longer be part of our world." As the reality of his ultimatum settled over her like a suffocating blanket, Camilla felt something inside her break. It wasn't just the betrayal of being forced to choose between her family and her position. It was the realization that the man she had loved for decades was capable of this level of coldness, this complete separation of personal feeling from royal obligation. The woman who had stood by his side through scandals and public criticism, who had endured years of hatred and resentment to earn her place beside the throne, was being told that her family, the people who had raised her and shaped her and loved her long before she ever met Charles, were no longer worthy of his tolerance. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, casting the same golden light that had illuminated so many happier moments in this room. But everything had changed, and Camilla knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of Charles's ultimatum pressed down on Camilla like a physical force as she sat in the leather chair, struggling to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed to her. The familiar study suddenly felt like foreign territory, every cherished memory tainted by this moment of betrayal. She could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears as she tried to find words that could somehow bridge the chasm that had just opened between them. "You can't be serious," she said finally, her voice stronger than she felt. "Charles, these are my children. My brother. They're not perfect, but they're family. You can't just dismiss them like servants who've misbehaved." The king moved back to his desk, placing his hands flat on its polished surface as he leaned forward slightly. The gesture was subtle, but it created an even greater sense of distance between them, as if he were a judge delivering a verdict from his bench. "I'm not dismissing them, Camilla. I'm protecting the crown from further damage." His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the tone he used when addressing Parliament or making state declarations. "The monarchy has weathered many storms over the centuries, but we have survived because we know when to make difficult choices." Camilla stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking under the pressure of his coldness. "Difficult choices? Is that what you call abandoning the people who welcomed you into their family when the entire country was against our marriage? Have you forgotten how my children stood by us when every newspaper in Britain was calling me the most hated woman in the country?" For a moment, something flickered in Charles's eyes, a shadow of the man who had once told her that her family's acceptance had meant everything to him. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the steely resolve of a monarch who had made his decision. "I remember their support," he said quietly, "and I'm grateful for it. But gratitude cannot override my responsibility to the crown. Your son Tom's business dealings have been front-page news for 3 days running. The press is asking questions about royal endorsements, about whether palace connections gave him unfair advantages in securing government contracts." "Those are allegations," Camilla protested, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "Nothing has been proven. Tom is a successful businessman who's worked hard for everything he's achieved. Just because he's my son doesn't mean every success is somehow tainted." Charles straightened, his expression hardening. "The court circular shows 17 occasions in the past year when Tom attended royal functions as your guest. Photographers captured him in private conversations with cabinet ministers, foreign dignitaries, and business leaders who later awarded his company lucrative contracts. Whether the connections were intentional or coincidental, the appearance of impropriety is devastating." "Appearance," Camilla repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "Since when do we make decisions based on how things appear rather than how they actually are? You taught me that the monarchy's strength comes from its integrity, from doing what's right rather than what's politically expedient. And what's right," Charles said firmly, "is protecting the institution that will outlive us both. Your family's behavior threatens that institution. I cannot and will not allow personal sentiment to compromise my duty to the crown and to the British people. The formal language, the reference to duty over personal feeling, struck Camilla like a physical blow. She recognized the words because she had heard them before, not from Charles, but from his mother. Queen Elizabeth had used almost identical phrases when discussing the abdication crisis, when explaining why Edward VIII had been forced to choose between the crown and the woman he loved. The parallel was not lost on either of them. "So this is how it ends," Camilla said, her voice barely controlled. "After everything we've been through together, after all the promises you made about standing together against whatever came our way, you're going to sacrifice my family to protect your image." "This isn't about my image," Charles replied, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "This is about the stability of the monarchy during a critical period in British history. We're facing economic uncertainty, political upheaval, and a public that's increasingly questioning the relevance of the crown. I cannot afford to give them additional reasons to doubt our judgment." Camilla walked to the window where Charles had stood earlier, looking out at the gardens where they had planned their future together in happier times. The roses she had helped plant were blooming magnificently, their red petals bright against the green lawn. It seemed impossible that such beauty could exist in the same world where this conversation was taking place. "You're asking me to choose," she said without turning around. "You're asking me to abandon the people who raised me, who shaped me into the woman you claim to love, in order to preserve an institution that has never fully accepted me anyway. I'm asking you to understand that sometimes love requires sacrifice," Charles said, and, for the first time since she had entered the room, his voice carried a note of genuine pain. "Do you think this is easy for me? Do you imagine I want to cause you this kind of hurt?" She turned to face him, and what she saw in his expression gave her a moment of hope. The mask of royal duty had slipped slightly, revealing the man underneath, the man who had courted her for decades and had fought against tremendous opposition to make her his wife. But even as she recognized that man, she could see him struggling to disappear behind the crown once again. "If it's so difficult, then don't do it," she said, moving closer to his desk. "Charles, we can find another way. We can manage the media attention, establish clearer boundaries, provide better guidance to my family about their public behavior. There has to be a solution that doesn't involve cutting them out of our lives completely." The king shook his head slowly, and, in that gesture, Camilla saw the final death of her hopes. "The decision has already been made. My private secretary has prepared statements for the press explaining that members of your family will no longer attend official royal functions. Their security details will be withdrawn, their access to royal residences will be revoked, and any business relationships that may have developed through royal connections will be severed." The clinical precision of his language, the careful planning that had obviously gone into this moment, revealed the depth of his betrayal. This wasn't a spontaneous decision driven by recent events. This was a calculated move that had been developed over time, discussed with advisors, planned and prepared while he continued to share her bed and accept her support. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked, the question emerging from a place of growing rage. "How long have you been meeting with your advisors, crafting your statements, preparing to destroy my family while pretending that everything was normal between us?" Charles had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he didn't deny the accusation. "The discussions began several weeks ago when the extent of the media attention became clear. I had hoped we could find a less drastic solution, but each day brought new headlines, new questions, new damage to our reputation." "Our reputation," Camilla repeated. "Or your reputation? Because it seems to me that you're perfectly willing to sacrifice my family's reputation to protect your own." "That's not fair," Charles said, but his protest lacked energy. "Everything I do reflects on the monarchy. Every decision I make affects the future of the crown. I don't have the luxury of putting personal relationships above institutional needs." Camilla felt something cold settle in her chest as she realized that she was not seeing a moment of weakness or poor judgment. This was Charles showing her exactly who he was when forced to choose between love and duty. She had always known that the crown came first for him, had accepted it as part of the price of loving a future king. But she had never imagined that acceptance would extend to sacrificing her family on the altar of royal protocol. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside her. "What happens to the woman who gave up her private life, who endured years of public hatred, who stood by your side through every crisis and scandal? Do I simply pretend that my family no longer exists? Do I attend state dinners and public engagements while my children and my brother are treated like pariahs? You continue to be queen consort, Charles said. But his words sounded hollow even to himself. You continue to fulfill your duties to the crown, and to support my reign as you always have. Without the people who matter most to me in the world, Camilla said. Without the family that made me who I am. You're asking me to become someone else entirely, to pretend that the most important relationships in my life simply don't exist. The silence that followed stretched between them like an unbridgeable gulf. Outside the study, the castle continued to function as it had for centuries, with servants going about their duties and courtiers preparing for the day's business. But inside this room, the foundations of a marriage and a partnership were crumbling with each passing moment. I'm sorry, Charles said finally, and, for an instant, his voice carried genuine regret. I'm truly sorry that it has come to this. But I cannot change my decision. The welfare of the monarchy must take precedence over personal considerations. As Camilla looked at her husband standing behind his desk in his perfectly pressed suit, with his perfectly groomed hair and his perfectly rehearsed explanations, she realized that she was saying goodbye to more than just her family's place in royal life. She was saying goodbye to the man she had believed Charles to be, the man she had thought would choose love over politics when the moment of crisis finally arrived. The woman who had once believed that their love could overcome any obstacle was discovering that some obstacles were too large even for royal devotion to surmount. And the most devastating part was the growing certainty that Charles had known this moment would come long before she had even suspected it was possible. The afternoon shadows had grown longer in the king's study as the confrontation stretched on, each word exchanged creating deeper wounds that both Charles and Camilla knew would never fully heal. The formal distance that Charles had maintained throughout their conversation was beginning to take its toll on both of them, but neither seemed willing or able to bridge the gap that had opened between them. Camilla returned to her chair, not out of deference to royal protocol, but because her legs suddenly felt too weak to support her. The magnitude of what was happening was finally settling in, and with it came a crushing realization about the true nature of the life she had chosen when she married the king. You want to know what the truly heartbreaking part of all this is? She said, her voice quiet but steady. It's not that you're choosing the crown over my family. I always knew that might happen someday. It's that you've been planning this betrayal while lying to me every night about your love and commitment. Charles winced at the word betrayal, but he didn't deny the accusation. I haven't been lying to you about my feelings. My love for you hasn't changed, Camilla. But love alone isn't enough to solve the problems we're facing. Isn't it? She asked, looking directly into his eyes for the first time since the conversation began. Because I remember a different man telling me that our love was worth fighting for, worth enduring public hatred and family opposition and constitutional challenges. That man promised me that nothing would ever come between us again. The king moved away from his desk, walking to the fireplace where portraits of his ancestors looked down from their gilded frames. Each face represented a monarch who had faced impossible choices, who had been forced to balance personal desires against royal duty. The weight of their collective judgment seemed to press down on him as he struggled to find words that could somehow justify his decision. That man was naive, he said finally. He believed that love could conquer institutional realities, that personal happiness could coexist with royal responsibilities without compromise. Experience has taught me otherwise. Camilla felt something breaking inside her chest, a physical sensation of loss that was almost overwhelming. So you're saying that everything we've built together, everything we've shared, was based on a delusion? That the promises you made were simply the fantasies of a naive man who didn't understand his own limitations? I'm saying that I was wrong to believe we could have everything, Charles replied, his voice carrying a note of defeat. I was wrong to think that I could be both a devoted husband and an effective king without eventually having to choose between them. And you chose the crown, Camilla said, the statement hanging between them like a final judgment. When the moment came, when you had to decide what mattered most, you chose an institution over the woman who gave up everything to stand beside you. The accusation hit its mark, and Charles's composure finally began to crack. Do you think this is what I wanted? Do you imagine that I'm enjoying this moment? I'm destroying the happiness of the woman I love to preserve something that will outlive us both. How is that supposed to feel satisfying? Then, don't do it, Camilla said, rising from her chair again with renewed energy. Charles, it's not too late. Cancel the statements, reverse the decisions, find another way to address the media attention. We can work together to solve these problems without sacrificing my family. For a moment, Hope flickered in her chest as she saw uncertainty cross his features. This was the opening she had been waiting for, the crack in his resolve that might allow her to reach the man beneath the crown. But, even as she recognized the opportunity, she watched it slip away as Charles straightened his shoulders and assumed the posture of absolute authority. "The decision is final," he said, and his voice had returned to the formal tone that made her feel like a stranger in her own marriage. "The statements will be released this afternoon. Your family's access to royal events and residences ends immediately. There will be no further discussion of this matter." The finality in his voice was like a door slamming shut on 20 years of shared dreams and mutual devotion. Camilla felt the last of her hope drain away, replaced by a cold fury that surprised her with its intensity. "I see," she said, her own voice becoming distant and formal. "So this is how the monarchy operates when the cameras aren't rolling. This is how the institution that claims to represent stability and continuity treats the people who sacrifice everything to serve it." "This is how the monarchy survives," Charles corrected. "This is how we ensure that there will still be a crown for future generations, even when the cost is higher than we want to pay." Camilla walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the brass handle. "Tell me, Charles, when you're lying alone in your bed tonight, thinking about what you've done today, will the knowledge that you've preserved the monarchy for future generations be enough to compensate for the destruction of your marriage?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence, demanding an answer that Charles seemed unable or unwilling to provide. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know." "Well, when you figure it out, you'll know where to find me," Camilla said, opening the door. "I'll be in my chambers, preparing to attend state functions while pretending that the people who matter most to me in this world have suddenly ceased to exist." She stepped into the corridor, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the vast castle like the sound of something precious being irreparably broken. The hallway that had felt familiar and welcoming just hours earlier now seemed foreign and hostile, a place where she no longer belonged despite her royal title. As she walked back toward her private apartments, Camilla noticed that the castle staff she encountered seemed to avoid her eyes, their respectful greetings carrying an undertone of discomfort that suggested word of the morning's confrontation had already begun to spread. The efficient royal communication system that kept everyone informed of important developments had apparently been working overtime to ensure that her humiliation would be complete. The realization that her private pain was already becoming public knowledge added another layer to her anguish. Not only had Charles betrayed her trust and abandoned her family, but he had done so in a way that would make her humiliation visible to everyone around them. She would have to continue performing her royal duties while everyone who served them knew that her marriage was a hollow shell, that the partnership they had once celebrated was now nothing more than a political arrangement. When she reached her chambers, Camilla found her personal secretary waiting with a stack of papers and an expression of barely concealed sympathy. The woman had worked for her for over a decade, had been through every crisis and celebration of her royal life, and her presence was both a comfort and a reminder of how much was about to change. "Your Majesty," the secretary said carefully, "I've received some instructions from His Majesty's office regarding changes to the schedule for upcoming events. It appears that some adjustments will need to be made to the guest lists." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality of what was happening. Charles's efficient staff was already implementing his decision, systematically erasing her family from every aspect of royal life with the same clinical precision that characterized all palace operations. "I see," Camilla said, accepting the papers without looking at them. "And I assume these changes are to be implemented immediately?" "Yes, Your Majesty. The new protocols take effect today." Camilla nodded, feeling the weight of her royal training taking over even as her personal world collapsed around her. She had spent years learning to maintain her composure in public, to project strength and dignity even when everything inside her was falling apart. Those lessons were serving her well now, allowing her to function even as her heart was breaking. "Thank you for handling these arrangements," she said to her secretary. "I know this puts you in a difficult position." The woman's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine concern. "Is there anything I can do to help, Your Majesty?" "Anything at all." The offer of support, however limited, was almost enough to break Camilla's carefully maintained composure. But she knew that showing weakness now would only make things worse, would give Charles and his advisors additional justification for their belief that she was not strong enough to handle the pressures of royal life. Just continue to do your job as professionally as you always have, Camilla replied. That's all any of us can do under the circumstances. As her secretary left with the revised schedules and guest lists, Camilla finally allowed herself to sit down and confront the full magnitude of what had just happened to her life. The woman who had entered Charles's study that morning as his beloved wife and trusted partner had emerged as little more than a royal ornament, expected to smile and wave and fulfill her ceremonial duties while her personal happiness was sacrificed to preserve the dignity of the crown. The most devastating part was the growing realization that this outcome had probably been inevitable from the moment she agreed to marry the heir to the throne. Charles had been trained from birth to put the monarchy above all other considerations, and she had been naive to believe that their love would be strong enough to overcome centuries of royal conditioning. As the afternoon light began to fade outside her windows, Camilla Parker Bowles, Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, sat alone in her private chambers and began to understand that the price of wearing a crown was higher than she had ever imagined possible. Evening had fallen over Windsor Castle by the time Camilla finally left her private chambers to face the inevitable. The formal dinner with the Portuguese delegation could not be postponed or cancelled, despite the personal crisis that had shattered her world just hours earlier. Royal duty demanded that she appear at Charles's side, smiling and gracious, as if nothing had changed between them. She had spent the afternoon in a strange state of emotional numbness, going through the motions of preparing for the evening while her mind struggled to process the magnitude of her loss. Her lady-in-waiting had helped her select the appropriate gown, jewelry, and accessories for the state dinner, all the while maintaining the careful silence that palace staff employed when they sensed that something significant had occurred in the private lives of the royals. The dress she chose was a deep sapphire blue that Charles had once told her brought out the color of her eyes. As she looked at herself in the mirror, Camilla wondered if he would even notice what she was wearing tonight, or if she had already become as invisible to him as her family would soon be to the rest of the royal household. The walk to the state dining room felt like a journey through a minefield. Every corridor held memories of happier times. Every portrait on the wall seemed to judge her for her inability to protect the people she loved most. The weight of her tiara, which had once felt like a symbol of her acceptance into the royal family, now felt like a burden she was being forced to carry in service of an institution that had ultimately rejected everything she held dear. When she reached the reception area where guests were gathering for pre-dinner drinks, Camilla paused to collect herself one final time. Through the open doors, she could see Charles engaged in conversation with the Portuguese ambassador, his public persona fully engaged as he discussed matters of mutual interest between their two countries. To any observer, he appeared to be the perfect host, completely at ease and thoroughly focused on his guests. But Camilla knew him too well to be fooled by his performance. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control in his gestures that suggested he was working harder than usual to maintain his composure. The morning's confrontation had affected him too, though he was managing to hide it better than she was. As she entered the reception room, conversations briefly paused as guests acknowledged her presence with appropriate bows and curtsies. The Portuguese delegation greeted her with the warm respect that visiting dignitaries always showed to the Queen Consort, completely unaware of the personal drama that had unfolded just hours earlier in the very castle where they were now being entertained. "Your Majesty," the Portuguese ambassador said, taking her hand with a courtly bow. "You look absolutely radiant this evening. Thank you for hosting us so graciously." Camilla smiled with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of royal conversation. "The pleasure is entirely ours, Ambassador. We're delighted to strengthen the bonds between our nations." The exchange was flawlessly executed, a perfect example of the diplomatic courtesy that was expected at such occasions. But, as she spoke the words, Camilla felt like she was watching herself from a distance, as if some other woman was wearing her dress and speaking her lines while the real Camilla remained trapped somewhere deep inside, screaming at the unfairness of it all. When Charles approached to escort her to dinner, their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw a flash of something that might have been regret. But it was gone so quickly that she couldn't be sure whether she had imagined it, or whether he had simply mastered the art of concealing his emotions even from her. "You look beautiful tonight," he murmured as he offered her his arm, the words automatic and hollow despite their apparent sincerity. "Thank you," she replied with equal formality, taking his arm as she had done hundreds of times before at similar events. But now the gesture felt like a performance rather than a natural expression of their partnership. The state dining room was magnificent, with its crystal chandeliers casting warm light over the perfectly arranged table settings and elaborate floral centerpieces. The room had been the setting for so many memorable evenings during their marriage, dinners where they had worked together as a team to advance British interests and strengthen international relationships. Tonight, it felt like a stage set for the final act of a tragedy. As they took their places at the head of the table, Camilla found herself seated between the Portuguese ambassador and the cultural minister, both charming conversationalists who were clearly eager to make the most of their evening with British royalty. Under normal circumstances, she would have genuinely enjoyed their company and their stories about Portuguese art and literature. Tonight, she struggled to focus on their words while her mind kept returning to the morning's devastating confrontation. "Your Majesty," the cultural minister was saying, "we understand that you're quite passionate about literacy programs. We'd be very interested in learning about your initiatives in that area." The question forced Camilla to engage more fully with the conversation, drawing on years of experience discussing her charitable work. As she spoke about reading programs and library funding, she realized that this was one of the few areas of her royal life that remained genuinely hers, that Charles's decision to banish her family couldn't touch her commitment to causes that mattered to her. But even as she found her footing in the familiar territory of charitable work, she was acutely aware of Charles's presence beside her. He was carrying on his own conversations with practiced ease, discussing trade relationships and cultural exchanges with the diplomatic skill that had served him well throughout his long preparation for kingship. To their guests, they must have appeared to be the perfect royal couple, united in their commitment to serving their country and advancing its interests. The irony was almost unbearable. Here they were, playing their roles to perfection while their private world lay in ruins around them. The institution they were both serving so faithfully tonight was the same institution that had demanded the sacrifice of her family's place in their lives. The crown that they both wore so gracefully was the same crown that had ultimately proven more important to Charles than the woman who wore it beside him. As course followed course through the elaborate dinner, Camilla found herself studying Charles with new eyes. She watched the way he gestured when making a point, the way he listened intently when others were speaking, the way he occasionally glanced in her direction to include her in the conversation. All of these behaviors were familiar to her from years of shared meals and joint appearances, but tonight they seemed like the actions of a stranger. This was the man who had courted her for decades, who had defied tremendous opposition to make her his wife, who had once told her that life without her would be meaningless. But this was also the man who could calmly order her family's banishment from their world while maintaining perfect composure at a state dinner just hours later. The contradiction was so profound that she began to wonder if she had ever really known him at all. During a lull in the conversation, Charles leaned slightly toward her and spoke in the low voice they had always used for private communication at public events. "You're doing beautifully tonight. I know this isn't easy." The words might have been intended as comfort or encouragement, but they struck Camilla as the height of hypocrisy. Here was the man who had created this impossible situation acknowledging her pain while doing nothing to alleviate it. The casual cruelty of it took her breath away. "Thank you," she replied with the same formal politeness she might have shown to any dignitary. "I've always understood that duty comes first." The slight emphasis she placed on the word duty made it clear that she was throwing his own justification back at him. For just a moment, she saw him flinch, and she knew that her meaning had not been lost on him. But the moment of acknowledgement was brief, and soon he was back to his conversation with the Portuguese Prime Minister about renewable energy initiatives. As the evening wore on, Camilla began to feel like she was attending her own funeral, watching the burial of the woman she had been that morning before Charles's devastating revelation. The queen consort who was smiling and chatting and fulfilling her ceremonial role was a different person entirely from the woman who had believed that love could overcome any obstacle. When the dinner finally ended and the guests began to depart with expressions of gratitude and promises to strengthen ties between their countries, Camilla felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the length of the evening. She had successfully performed her royal duties, had represented the crown with dignity and grace, had maintained the facade that everything was normal between the king and queen. But the cost of that performance was almost more than she could bear. As she said goodbye to the last of the Portuguese delegation and walked beside Charles toward their private quarters, she realized that this was what the rest of her life would look like. She would attend state dinners and public engagements, smile for photographs, and make gracious speeches, all while pretending that her heart hadn't been shattered by the man walking silently beside her. When they reached the point where their corridors diverged toward their separate bedrooms, Charles paused, as if he wanted to say something. For a moment, Camilla allowed herself to hope that he might have reconsidered his decision, that the evening's facade of normalcy had reminded him of what they stood to lose. "Camilla," he said softly, and something in his voice made her heart leap with desperate optimism. "I want you to know that none of this changes how I feel about you. You're still the woman I love, still my partner in everything that matters." The words that might once have comforted her now felt like salt in an open wound. How could he speak of love while simultaneously destroying everything that love was supposed to protect? How could he claim her as a partner while making decisions that affected her most fundamental relationships without even consulting her? "Good night, Charles," she said, unable to trust herself to say anything more. "I'll see you tomorrow for the appointment with the Archbishop." As she walked away from him toward her private chambers, Camilla felt the full weight of her isolation settling around her like a heavy cloak. She was the queen consort of the United Kingdom, one of the most privileged women in the world, surrounded by luxury and deference at every turn. But she had never felt more alone in her life. The woman who had once believed that becoming queen would be the culmination of a fairy tale romance was beginning to understand that fairy tales were just stories told to children who didn't yet understand how cruel the real world could be. The morning after the Portuguese state dinner dawned gray and cold, matching Camilla's mood as she prepared for what she knew would be one of the most difficult days of her royal life. The Archbishop of Canterbury was scheduled to visit for their quarterly meeting about the church's role in the monarchy, and she would have to sit beside Charles and discuss matters of faith and moral guidance while pretending that their marriage hadn't been destroyed just 24 hours earlier. As she dressed for the meeting, Camilla caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The face was the same. The carefully styled hair and expertly applied makeup were flawless as always, but something fundamental had changed in her eyes. The warmth and hope that had sustained her through years of public criticism and private challenges had been replaced by a cold determination that surprised her with its intensity. She was no longer the woman who had entered Charles's study yesterday morning with love and trust in her heart. That woman had been naive enough to believe that royal marriage was still, at its core, a marriage between two people who cared for each other above all else. The woman in the mirror had learned that royal marriage was ultimately a political arrangement, and that personal feelings were expendable when they conflicted with institutional needs. The realization should have been devastating, but, instead, Camilla found it oddly liberating. If Charles could treat their relationship as a business partnership when it suited his purposes, then she could do the same. If he could sacrifice her family's happiness to protect his image, then she could protect her own interests with equal ruthlessness. When she arrived at the blue drawing room where the meeting was to take place, she found Charles already seated at the small conference table with several thick folders of documents spread before him. He looked up when she entered, and she saw him searching her face for some sign of the emotional devastation he had witnessed the previous morning. But her expression gave nothing away, maintaining the perfect composure that years of royal training had taught her to project in any circumstance. "Good morning, Camilla," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I trust you slept well." "Quite well, thank you," she replied, taking her seat across from him with the same formal politeness she might have shown to any colleague. "I'm looking forward to our discussion with His Grace about the upcoming Jubilee celebrations." The subtle reminder that she would be expected to participate fully in future royal events, despite the destruction of her personal life, was not lost on Charles. She watched him register her meaning, saw him understand that she was not going to make things easier for him by withdrawing from public life or showing visible signs of distress that might complicate his carefully managed public image. When the Archbishop arrived, he brought with him the moral authority of the Church of England and a lifetime of experience counseling people through their darkest moments. The Right Reverend Dr. Michael Hartwell had served as Archbishop for nearly a decade, and his gentle wisdom had helped guide the royal family through several previous crises. But, as he settled into his chair and began his customary opening prayer, Camilla wondered if even his considerable experience had prepared him for the level of dysfunction that was about to be revealed. "Your Majesties," he began after the prayer concluded, "I wanted to begin today by discussing the Church's role in the upcoming Jubilee celebrations. We see this as an opportunity to reinforce the spiritual foundations of the monarchy and to remind the public of the sacred nature of the royal oath. Charles leaned forward with apparent interest, fully engaged in his role as the supreme governor of the Church of England. That's exactly the kind of messaging we need to emphasize, Your Grace. The monarchy's legitimacy rests not just on constitutional law, but on our commitment to serving God and serving the people in accordance with Christian principles. The irony of Charles discussing Christian principles less than 24 hours after destroying his wife's family was almost overwhelming, but Camilla maintained her composed expression as she added her own thoughts to the conversation. I think it's particularly important that we emphasize the values of forgiveness and compassion, she said, her voice carrying just enough emphasis to make her meaning clear to Charles while remaining appropriately respectful to the Archbishop. After all, the Church teaches us that mercy should triumph over judgment, especially within families. The Archbishop nodded thoughtfully, unaware of the personal subtext behind her words. Absolutely, Your Majesty. The royal family's example of Christian living has always been central to the monarchy's moral authority. When the public sees that you govern your personal relationships according to gospel principles, it reinforces their faith in your ability to govern the nation with wisdom and compassion. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Camilla saw that her strategy was working exactly as she had intended. Every reference to Christian values, every mention of family loyalty and forgiveness, was a reminder of how far his own behavior had fallen short of the standards he claimed to uphold. Of course, she continued, the challenge is maintaining those principles even when external pressures encourage us to prioritize political considerations over personal relationships. It would be so easy to sacrifice the people we love most in order to avoid criticism or controversy. Indeed, the Archbishop agreed, warming to the theme. But that's precisely when our faith must be strongest. When the world tells us to abandon our commitments for the sake of convenience or public opinion, that's when we must hold most firmly to the teachings of Christ about loyalty and love. The conversation continued in this vein for over an hour, with Camilla carefully weaving references to family loyalty, forgiveness, and moral courage throughout the discussion while Charles grew increasingly uncomfortable beside her. She was using the Archbishop's own moral authority against her husband, forcing him to sit silently, while Christian principles that condemned his behavior were presented as the foundation of effective royal leadership. When the meeting finally concluded and the Archbishop had departed with expressions of gratitude for their continued commitment to Christian governance, Charles and Camilla were left alone in the blue drawing room with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid hanging between them. That was extremely well played, Charles said finally, his voice carrying a note of grudging admiration mixed with anger. Using the Archbishop to deliver a sermon on family loyalty was quite clever. I have no idea what you mean, Camilla replied with perfect innocence. I was simply participating in a discussion about the monarchy's moral foundations. Surely you don't object to reinforcing Christian values in our public messaging. The look Charles gave her was unlike anything she had ever seen from him before. It was the look of a man who had underestimated his opponent and was suddenly realizing that the game had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. What are you planning, Camilla? He asked bluntly. What's this really about? She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard where tourists were already gathering for the daily changing of the guard. These people had traveled from around the world to witness a ceremony that celebrated tradition, loyalty, and the enduring strength of British institutions. They had no idea that the royal marriage they idealized was collapsing behind the facade of public duty. I'm not planning anything, she said without turning around. I'm simply adjusting my expectations about what this marriage actually is. You've made it very clear that personal relationships are subordinate to political considerations, so I'm learning to think the same way. Meaning what exactly? Camilla turned to face him, and Charles saw that the woman looking back at him was fundamentally different from the one he had married. The love and trust that had once characterized her expression had been replaced by something harder, more calculating. Meaning that I understand my role now, she said. I'm not your wife in any meaningful sense of the word. I'm a political asset whose job is to smile and wave and make you look like a devoted family man while you make whatever decisions you believe are necessary to protect the crown. That's not true, Charles protested, but his words lacked conviction. You know that's not how I see you. Do I? Camilla asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've reduced me to a ceremonial position whose opinions and feelings are irrelevant to any decisions that actually matter. Yesterday, you unilaterally destroyed my family's place in our lives without even consulting me. Today, we sat through a meeting about Christian values while you refused to acknowledge the moral bankruptcy of your own behavior. Charles stood and moved toward her, but she held up a hand to stop his approach. Don't, she said firmly. Don't try to comfort me or explain how difficult this is for you. You made your choice, Charles. You chose the crown over everything else, and now you have to live with the consequences of that decision. And what are those consequences? He asked, though something in his voice suggested that he already suspected the answer. Camilla smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. You wanted a queen consort who would fulfill her duties without causing problems for your reign. Congratulations. That's exactly what you're going to get. I'll attend every state dinner, every public engagement, every charity event. I'll smile for the cameras and make gracious speeches and represent the crown with perfect dignity. And in private? Charles asked, though he seemed almost afraid to hear her answer. In private, we'll maintain whatever level of civility is necessary to avoid public scandal. But don't expect anything more than that. Don't expect warmth or affection or the kind of partnership we once shared. You killed that yesterday when you chose to protect your image instead of protecting our marriage. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of traffic and tourists outside the palace walls. Charles looked like a man who had won a battle only to discover that his victory had cost him everything that made winning worthwhile. I never wanted it to be this way, he said finally. But this is the way you chose to make it, Camilla replied. And now we both have to live with the consequences of your decision. As she walked toward the door, Charles called after her one final time. Camilla, please, can't we find some way to work through this together? She paused with her hand on the door handle, and, for just a moment, he saw a flash of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and final. You made it very clear yesterday that we don't work through things together, Charles. You make decisions based on what's best for the crown, and I adjust my life accordingly. That's the arrangement you wanted, and that's the arrangement you now have. The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the vast palace like the sound of a coffin being sealed. King Charles III, defender of the faith and head of the Commonwealth, sat alone in the blue drawing room and began to understand that some victories come at a price too high for even a king to pay. Outside his window, the changing of the guard continued with its ancient precision, a reminder that the monarchy would endure regardless of the personal cost to those who wore its crowns. But, as Charles contemplated the hollowness of his triumph, he wondered if preserving an institution was worth destroying the only relationship that had ever made his royal burden bearable. The queen consort continued her duties with flawless professionalism, but the woman he had loved was gone forever, sacrificed on the altar of royal duty along with everything else that had once made his life worth living.